Hello, I'm JW, and the Wiring Regulations, which is currently this yellow publication, is changing, and you may well have seen this before, and the new one is this blue one, which is a considerable change from the yellow one because this is actually an entirely new edition. This is the 18th edition. Previously, of course, it's the 17th edition we had there, and although there were several amendments to the 17th edition, those were relatively minor things, whereas this one, say, a whole new thing, and whole sections of it have been totally rewritten and changed. So a lot of changes going on in this one. Now this is currently available for sale, and that's effective from July 2018 when this video is being made. However, this isn't actually going to effect until January 2019, so many months away. But certainly useful to get up to date with what the changes are going to be, hopefully before the January date. And of course for the moment we're still using the yellow one, so until the end of 2018 this is the one which is going to be used. And this also applies to things designed up to the end of this year, which of course may well be installed sometime next year. Now the on-site guide, which is currently this yellow one, again there is a new one of these out as well, that's also a blue one. I'll be looking at that at a later date, so I don't currently have one of those, but certainly this has now been available. So let's have a quick look through this, and this video just going to cover the sort of major changes, and then in future videos we'll have a look at some of those in a bit more detail. Now, so this is the new 18th edition, and if you're going to buy one of these things, do make sure to buy it from a reputable supplier. Basically, if it seems too cheap compared to anyone else, then there's obviously a reason for that. Fake ones of these sadly do exist. This should have a hologram on the inside here, which has the IET logo and various things inside there. And retail price of this thing at the moment is £95. Although the Amazon price for this one currently is about 81 or something like that, so they are currently doing it for a bit less. But basically, if you went somewhere and found it was on offer for like 40 quid or something, then be suspicious, because it's not generally that price. And I know everybody likes to complain about the price of these things. The reality is that's the kind of price that these things are. So just have a quick look inside on the introduction here, which covers the main changes. And this particular publication does have a lot more pages in this. This particular one, that's in the same size, A4 pages, but this has 560 pages, whereas the previous one only had 496. So there's an extra 64 pages of something in there, so quite a considerable amount of extra stuff. And of course that's before we get into all the stuff that's actually been changed and altered, so a significant amount of extra things there. But so we'll have a look just through the introduction here, just to cover some of the main items there. So we've got here the 2018 version comes into effect from the 1st of January 2019, and it applies to things designed after 31st December 2018, of course, which need to comply with the edition we're looking at the moment. And important to note there that the design thing is what really defines the date, so it's perfectly fine to actually design something, say this year, and not install it until, say, January, February or whatever next year. It's when it's designed that the thing matters, not necessarily when it's installed. But of course in many cases the designing and installing is going to happen pretty much around the same time anyway. And in terms of the layout, it is pretty much the same. It's in the same sort of order, so the various parts are essentially the same, and the chapters and the numbering within again is pretty much all the same, except in a few minor instances. So general layout and content, same kind of order it was before, no real surprises there. So part 1, the only real change here is this new 13313, and there's a minor modification there, and basically it requires certain use of equipment to be recorded on the electrical certification specified in part 6, so it really just fits in with the changes to the certificates and things at the end there. And all this is applying to is essentially where, if you're going to use equipment that doesn't comply with one of the standards that's referred to in here, say it's some new thing that was just invented or whatever, then it needs to be recorded on the certificate as such, but fairly minor item there. And again, part 2 with the definitions, there's a fairly reasonable number of changes there, certain new ones and expansions or whatever. So again, that just fits in with the rest of it, as obviously some things have been added and altered. But again, nothing desperately significant in there. Now part 41, or chapter 41, protection against electric shock, this is one that does have quite a lot of changes. And again, some of the main ones are shown here. Metallic pipes entering the building having an insulating section at the point of entry need not be connected to the protective equipotential bonding. So this is typically going to be things like the water pipes coming into your house or property. And previously, if they were metallic pipes in the building, they would have needed to be bonded, but now if there's a plastic or basically insulating part at the point of entry, then you don't actually need to connect those to the bonding. And this is quite common in a lot of properties now, particularly those that have plastic incoming supplies, or even want to have metallic incoming supplies, and then it changes to plastic within the building. And again, a fairly common thing these days. So that does not need to be bonded any longer. And the same would apply to gas, although of course gas generally is not plastic within the property because that's not actually permitted. But gas pipes being in plastic up to the property are certainly a thing. But generally that's going to be underground stuff for plastic only. And of course it can apply to other pipes as well, such as waste pipes. Some of those have been metallic in the past, sort of copper or cast iron or whatever. So again, if you've got to say cast iron soil stack or something, if that's then coming into your bathroom and then it changes over to plastic when it's in the room, again that doesn't actually need to be bonded either anymore. And moving on to the next one then, the disconnection times in the table 41.1 now apply to circuits up to 63 amps with one or more socket outlets, and final circuits up to 32 amps supplying only connected current using equipment, so as in fixed stuff, not plugs in. So that's basically expanded to cover more stuff. 4133 now applies to socket outlets with a rated current not exceeding 32 amps, and there's an exception to omit RCD protection where, other than a dwelling, a documented risk assessment determines that RCD protection is not necessary. Now, previously you could do this for, say, a specific socket outlet. So you had one for a specific appliance like a freezer or something. You could, in theory, label that as sort of freezer only and then not have RCD protection on that. However, that's no longer permitted. So essentially all socket outlets in your house or other kinds of dwellings will need to have RCD protection regardless of what they're used for. The only exception now is in places other than dwellings where you can have a documented risk assessment. So it's going to be commercial premises, that type of thing. Obviously you can't have risk assessments done in a dwelling because it's not a controlled environment. So RCD is pretty much for all socket outlets regardless of what they are. And following on the RCD theme, 41134 is a new one, which means that all lighting circuits within household or domestic premises also need RCD coverage. So again, the standard up to the 30 milliamp type. Now currently, at the moment, you don't need to have RCD protection on lighting circuits, but in reality the vast majority probably do, simply for the fact of the cabling in the walls, because if you're going to use the twin and earth type cabling and it's going to be buried in the walls, then that does require an RCD regardless of what type of circuit it is. However, it is possible to say use things like steel conduit or armoured type cables, or in fact bury them deeper than 50mm in the wall, and in those circumstances lighting at the moment does not need an RCD, but effectively from next year all lighting circuits need an RCD regardless. So again, that's an addition there, but in reality it's not going to be a huge change because most new installations in household or domestic premises will have an RCD on the lighting anyhow, so purely for the fact of the cables obviously supplying those. Addition here, which means you can't have a switching or isolating device in a PEN conductor. That's the protective earth and neutral, basically where they're combined. Not something that's like to come up that often, and obviously you can't put a switch in it if you have got one. But again, switching that is not likely to be a particularly common thing anyway. It's just basically been added in, so you definitely can't do it anymore. A few changes to those. Again, we'll look at all of these in more detail in a later time. A lot of stuff concerning IT systems, and this is the isolated earth type of system, not to be confused with computer equipment. It's nothing to do with that. It's where you've got the earthing for the installation is either not connected to the actual body of the ground, or it is connected to that through a very high impedance. So quite a lot of changes there. But again, that's a fairly unusual system to use, so in most cases that's not going to be something to be desperately concerned over. And a new regulation, group 419, which is regarding automatic disconnection where it's not feasible, such as electronic equipment with limited short circuit current. Again, a fairly specialised sort of area there. Again, we'll look at these in more detail at a different date. Now, chapter 42, which we've got here, protection against thermal effects. Got a new regulation there, 4117, and this is recommending the installation of arc fault detection devices, or AFDDs, to mitigate the risk of fire in AC final circuits of an installation due to the effects of arc fault currents. Now, these devices have been available in the UK, but pretty much never used. They're very expensive at the moment, and certainly not the kind of thing which most people would even heard of, or never mind actually use. They are more common in certain other countries, North America particularly, where they're called something slightly different, but the basic principle is the same. It's a device, electronic primarily, which looks similar to a circuit breaker, and if there's an arc within a circuit, so in other words it's sort of sparking between two conductors, then it's designed to detect that and disconnect in that instance. But notably it's a recommendation. It does not mean that they're required, and it's unlikely, I think, we're going to see many of these for several years yet, because say at the moment they are fairly expensive items, not particularly commonplace things to find. And there's also the question of whether these things are in fact actually needed, given the fact that they're only supposed to detect an arc which goes for presumably an extended time, obviously risk of fire or whatever. But given that most circuits in the UK are designed to have a very low impedance, and therefore if a fault occurs it's designed to have a high current which will disconnect the circuit breaker or whatever anyway. No doubt there may be circumstances where that doesn't happen, but they're certainly not going to be in your normal installation. 42221 has been changed. Again, this goes under the thermal effect again, so quite a number of conditions have been deleted and various things have been changed and amended, so again we'll look at those again at a later time. Now chapter 44, which is protection against voltage disturbances and electromagnetic disturbances. Various changes have been put in here. Most of this is referring to things like lightning, and obviously lightning protection, which obviously can cause all kinds of issues in various systems. So again, we'll look at that in more detail at the next time, but essentially quite a number of changes have been going on in there. Now chapter 46, isolation and switching. This is a new chapter 46, and it basically deals with, it says there, non-automatic local and remote isolation and switching measures. So anything to do with, say, isolation, switching and so on. Remember, it's a whole new chapter. Now it's not actually entirely new, because if you have a look here, here is chapter 46, isolation and switching, and it goes over a number of pages, so it's not particularly new. This is actually from the 16th edition here, the brown one. So it is something that's existed before, has been removed, but now it's basically returned, and although the stuff in it is supposedly new, in reality it's actually been basically relocated from various other sections, which is where it went after it was taken away from the chapter which was deleted previously. So although it's new, it's really going back in a lot of ways to stuff that was already in there before and has moved and then has now been put back where it was to start with. Now chapter 52, this is a fairly significant change, and this is about the support of wiring systems. I've got a new regulation here, and in 202, which is replacing the 201. Now previously this was about ensuring that cables in escape routes were properly secured to be fire resistant, so the idea being that if a fire occurs, cables, say, attached to the ceiling or the walls or whatever, wouldn't actually fall down and actually get in the way and prevent people from either leaving the building or firefighters from entering the building. And the main change here is that aside from just applying to exit routes, this actually now applies throughout the installation, so basically everything, not just escape routes as previously there. So essentially this means that things like plastic fixings are no longer going to be valid, so plastic cable clips not as suitable as a solid means of support. And if you're going to use, say, the plastic mini trunking, you will need to have those metal additional supports inside. You can already buy those. And it also comes with things like plastic conduit, which at the moment typically has plastic fixings for it. But again, that's not going to be suitable because, of course, if that gets hot in, say, a fire or whatever, it's going to melt and the wire's going to fall down. So quite a lot of changes there in terms of supporting wiring. And so the main deal is that it now applies to the entire installation, not just in escape route. So it's going to apply pretty much anywhere. Chapter 53, which is about protection, isolation, switching, control and monitoring, completely revised, and again just deals with the things previously mentioned there. One reason for this being completely revised is that a lot of the switching and isolation, of course, has gone into that new chapter 46, which we just saw. So of course it's again about relocating a lot of stuff, though not necessarily a huge amount of new stuff. Devices for protection against overvoltage. So they're mainly on the selection and erection of SPDs, or surge protective devices. Again, not particularly common at the moment, but they're likely to become more common in the future, certainly with the prevalence of vast amounts of electronic equipment that's being used these days. So again, quite a large section on that. A couple of regulations here about earthing electrodes. Now in the draft version there was some proposed deal where all installations would have to have an earth electrode, including if they were TN, CS or TNS. That is not in this particular edition here, so that does not apply. So these particular ones here are more to do with changes to electrodes that would have already been put in anyway. It is not a requirement to start shoving electrodes in every particular installation, probably because, as many people pointed out previously, how in goodness name are you going to actually install earth electrodes on a 20th floor flat and other similar circumstances? A new scope there for other equipment in chapter 55. And we've got a new regulation there referring to ground recess luminaires, which are basically those things that people like to stick in their fancy driveways. So you have a new driveway put in and you put these little round beady lights set in the floor, shining directly upwards to illuminate the sky. So there's a whole section on things like that. Now part 6, which is inspection and testing, has been completely restructured, and essentially chapters 61, 62 and 63 have been deleted, and the content for those now goes into chapters 64 and 65. Now, although that's a fairly large change in terms of the numbering and the chapters, the actual content hasn't actually changed that much. So it's just really a question of renumbering it to comply with this other standard here, rather than actually changing a whole load of stuff in there. There are a couple of changes in there which we'll look at again later time, but suffice to say, as far as the content goes, pretty much the same as it is at the moment. Small number of changes here for construction and demolition site installations, and the rest of this page actually is in the 700 series, which is all of the various specific installations, so things like caravan camping parks, medical locations and so on. One of note here is 722. This is concerning electric vehicle charging installations, so significant changes have been made here, particularly in regards to a PMA supply, or basically TNCS. The exception saying reasonably practical has been deleted. So again, we'll look at that again in more detail, as there's quite a lot of changes, and of course electric vehicle charging is at the moment a fairly small thing, but obviously it's a growing industry, likely to become a very major thing in the fairly near future. Got a new section about electrical connections for inland navigation vessels. So again, things are going to be using at, say, marinas and that type of thing, but not for actually ones at the sea, basically ones for sort of inland waterways and the like. Heating cables and embedded heating systems, and this is sort of things you would have outside to de-ice your front driveway if you're rich, or things like runways, that kind of item there. So a certain number of changes. And then the appendixes here, which, bearing in mind, although they're in this book, they're not actually part of the regulations. They're more to do with either suggestions or references to refer to other things in here. Appendix 1 has been updated. That's just a list of all of the other standards to which are referred to in here, so of course they've just updated those as these things change. Appendix 3, time current characteristics of overcurrent protected devices and RCDs. Essentially we've now got the contents which was in Appendix 14 is now in this Appendix 3. So again, pretty much the same content, but it's obviously been relocated in there. Appendix 6, which is the model forms for certification reporting, so things like your minor work certificate, the EICR and so on. Minor changes to the certificates and the inspections. Nothing terribly dramatic there, but again, a few minor alterations. In terms of testing and things to go, it's pretty much the same as it always was, but still there are a couple of minor things there which have been altered. Appendix 8, which is current carrying capacity and voltage of for bus bar trunking and power track systems. So some changes there regarding the rating factors for those particular types of equipment. Appendix 14, that's the one which has been moved into Appendix 3. And Appendix 14 now has information on the determination of prospective fault current instead. So basically it's been relocated and something else put in its place. And finally here we've got number 17. Now in the draft of this was actually going to be part 8. However, it's ended up as an appendix, which means although it's in here and it's guidance, it's not something which is compulsory at the moment. But of course it says here it may well be developed into part 8 later, in which case it will then become a compulsory thing. But at the moment it is just an appendix, and it's primarily on the energy efficiency type of thing, so regarding how the installation is actually put in, and things like the length of cabling and minimising the amount of losses in cables. And it was actually a huge, extensive section in the part 8 in the draft copy. Probably a good thing it's been put into an appendix, because it looked to be a fairly well shoved together thing in the last 5 minutes type of effort. So they presumably put it in an appendix so that people can complain over it and mule over it for several years before it actually gets put into an official part. So a quick look there at the main changes in the new 18th edition, I'd say effectively from January 2019. So plenty of time to get up to date on these things. And there will be more videos in this series on the changes in more detail. But suffice to say, although there's a lot of stuff has changed and been added, there's nothing really fundamentally that's changed in the way that stuff works. Electricity still works in the same way as it always did, and things like the inspection, testing and certificates and all of the main requirements all remain pretty much along the same lines as they always did. And despite the fact that the draft item was put out last year and contained a whole pile of stuff, not everything that was in the draft is actually in the final publication, and including that thing about earth electrodes, so you do not have to start rushing around and trying to install earth electrodes in a 20th floor flat and all that kind of bother, because that's not actually in there. And although, say, there's quite a lot of new stuff in the back of there for the energy efficiency, it is only an appendix at this stage, so it is not a requirement, and it's certainly not mandatory to actually do that yet. But say probably a good idea to actually look at it anyway, because of course in some point it inevitably will turn into that new Part 8. And another point here is that although this is the 18th edition, it does not mean that all installations designed to the 17th and earlier are suddenly obsolete and dangerous, so there's no need to go rushing around and changing people's consumer units just because it happens to be an older model. That's been the same basically since forever. And likewise, just because it's the 18th edition doesn't necessarily mean you've got to start ripping out wires and putting in new stuff either. And although no manufacturers are going to start selling things like the 18th edition consumer unit and the 18th edition test equipment and all the rest of it, really it's just a load of nonsense, because test equipment is going to remain the same as it always did. Consumer units, whatever, pretty much going to be the same as well. The same choices are there, and they're all going to be perfectly compliant, just as they always were. So that's it for this time. So we'll do other videos on these in more detail, but until then, thanks for watching.